I'm suspicious if you say the phrase ruby shoes, this footwear is what would leap to most people's minds. But that's not what this DocuCommentary is about. It's not about ruby shoes. It's about Ruby's shoes. And I'm suspicious many viewers will not recognize this footwear. Most older Americans are familiar with the famous 1964 Norman Rockwell painting that he titled "The Problem We All Live With." The problem, of course, was rabid racism in the era of the fight for civil rights. For those who only remember Rockwell from his cheery paintings for covers on the Saturday Evening Post, this painting is quite startling. And no wonder. George Lorimer, the editor of the Post for Rockwell's first 20 years there, ordered him to never show colored people unless they were portrayed in servant-like roles. For example, this 1946 Rockwell cover depicts a young white boy, obviously traveling alone, in a railroad dining car. The black waiter hovers cheerfully and subserviently in the background as the boy studies the menu, trying to figure out what change he needs to take out of his coin purse to pay for his food and a tip. And it was obvious that the unspoken editorial policy of the Post never changed, even after the death of George Lorimer. During Rockwell's 45-plus year stint painting illustrations for covers of the Post, 323 in total over the years, you seldom even saw a colored face on the covers. The main subject of every cover painting was lily white. Rockwell's Post covers were virtually always sentimental and nostalgic when portraying the past, and cheery and optimistic, or at least humorous, when portraying contemporary life. They never addressed issues or unpleasantness of any kind, and evidently the Post editorial policy assumed that any portrayal of African Americans as anything more than servants, bystanders, or observers would be unpleasant for many Post readers. So how did this painting, with a young black girl front and center, addressing visually the very grim, unpleasant American issue of racism, make it into print? No mystery there. It wasn't painted for the Post. Rockwell had finished his long-running contractual connection to the Post in December 1963 and signed on with Look magazine to do illustration work for that publication starting in January 1964. And Look was ready and willing to tackle the reality of modern American life. The problem painting was featured as a two-page spread in Look in the January 14, 1964 issue as part of a theme of How We Live, exploring life across America in the early 1960s. This problem we all live with painting is so iconic, I sure wish I was able to say that I remember seeing it in Look myself back in 1964 when I was 17 years old. Actually, I kind of think I probably did, since my parents subscribed to Look back in those days. But if I did, I'm ashamed to say that it didn't have the gut-level impact on me that it should have had. It was many years later that I first actually remember seeing a reproduction of the painting in a Rockwell coffee table book. And even then, I had no conscious thought to wonder what the rest of the story behind it was. But I should have. The painting was not intended to portray some fictional child posed in a generic picture representing American racial unrest that was becoming epidemic at the time. It was about this real little girl named Ruby, who had a real life. A life that, in some ways, was responsible in part for changing the lives of millions of Americans who came after her. To understand Ruby's influence on the future of America, we need first to go back to the distant past of our country. The institution of slavery had ended in America in 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. To this day, many seem to vaguely assume that ushered in 150 years of freedom for the Negro population of the country that had been set free at the end of the Civil War. Many seem to vaguely assume that from that point on, African Americans finally became recipients of the promises of the Declaration of Independence, of equality of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unfortunately, that is not how the circumstances worked out at all. For a very short period of years, labeled by historians as Reconstruction, blacks throughout the states of the old Confederacy began voting and becoming an active part of U.S. society, a situation enforced by U.S. troops stationed there for the purpose in the South. But very quickly, the majority of whites in the Old South decided that they were unwilling to accept that level of equality for those who had formerly had no equality. And in a compromise between Southern and Northern political parties, orchestrated after the presidential election of 1876, Reconstruction was ended, all troops were removed, and white supremacy was restored throughout the area of the old Confederacy. Before the end of the 1800s, so-called Jim Crow laws and customs put in effect throughout the South had put the Negro back in his place, a place with a level of human dignity just short of how low it was under slavery. And that situation was declared constitutional by the Supreme Court in 1896 in a decision rendered regarding a court case titled Plessy v. Ferguson. The specific case had involved a challenge to a Louisiana law that had been put in effect in 1890, requiring separate railroad cars to be provided for use by blacks. The court declared that this law was not unconstitutional and did not deprive Negroes of their constitutional rights, as long as such provisions for racially separate facilities were what was termed separate but equal. The implication of the decision was that this principle could be applied by the state governments when regulating all public facilities, from trains and trolleys to public schools and libraries. And thus, throughout the South for the next 70 years, public services, facilities, and accommodations used by whites, such as buses, trains, trolleys, hotels, restaurants, libraries, movie theaters, even drinking fountains, were legally declared off-limits to blacks. Schools where white children attended were declared off-limits, and Negro schools were provided. Hospitals were either totally segregated, with blacks expected to go to totally separate hospitals, or at best, totally separate wings of the building were provided where they were to be treated. All of this was declared acceptable by the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision, as long as separate but equal accommodations for blacks were made available. But this was a laughable requirement from the very beginning. Facilities of every kind provided for blacks, from schools to train cars to restrooms to hospitals, yes, even to drinking fountains, were notoriously shabby and unquestionably not equal, if they were provided at all. And this situation continued for close to a century after the end of Reconstruction. Civil rights agitation had periodically been attempted throughout all those years, including the formation of the NAACP in 1909, but even the smallest changes seemed to never come. And then came World War II. Black men entered the military in large numbers and fought for their country. The needs of war production in U.S. factories, with so many men overseas in the active military, opened up good-paying jobs in many areas of the country like never before, even for black men and women. By the end of the war, many blacks expected that their record of service to their country would earn them better treatment and respect. But reality didn't often line up with those expectations, and especially in the South, Jim Crow laws and customs remained. By the early 1950s, many African Americans were no longer able to resign themselves to accept the inequalities of American life for their children and grandchildren, and new life was breathed into the civil rights movement. By 1954, the movement had produced its first major success. The Supreme Court ruled in 1954 in a case titled Brown v. Board of Education that separate but equal schools was a totally dishonest concept. Segregated schools were declared unequal by their very nature, and the court ordered that all public schools in America accept children of any race. Up to this point, even in areas where other Jim Crow laws were not enforced, such as separate drinking fountains, having segregated schools was very common. This was true in many northern and western states as well as the South. Some areas, particularly in the North and West, grudgingly accepted the orders to integrate their schools, but most areas of the South dug in their heels and resisted. In 1956, Southern U.S. congressmen created a document designed to counter the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education ruling of the Supreme Court, declaring opposition to forced racial integration of schools. Its official title was the Declaration of Constitutional Principles, but it was known informally as the Southern Manifesto. Its ultimate goal was to promote throughout the South what was termed massive resistance. It was signed by 101 politicians from Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. Only 3 Southern Democrats refused to sign: Albert Gore Sr., Estes Kefauver, and Lyndon B. Johnson. Their opposition earned them the scorn of their colleagues. The Southern Manifesto accused the Supreme Court of clear abuse of judicial power and promised to use all lawful means to resist forced implementation of the ruling and to eventually bring about a reversal of the decision. Here is the primary point of that manifesto. This unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusion in the states principally affected. It is destroying the amicable relations between the white and Negro races that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races. It has planted hatred and suspicion where there has been heretofore friendship and understanding. Yes, they were literally claiming that the Negroes of the South had been perfectly happy with the shabby, ill-equipped, inferior schools provided to them, and claiming that Negroes didn't mind at all going on a family car trip across the South, wondering if they'd be able to even find a place for their small children to pee and get a drink in the next town, much less find a place to get a meal and a room in a hotel to stay the night. Why, the white folks didn't mean nothing mean by that. They were just keeping things friendly and amicable. Yes, all the Negroes had a clear understanding. They understood that if they just kept their place, there would be no confusion. And this is where we introduce Ruby's shoes. Ruby was little Ruby Bridges of New Orleans, Louisiana. Ruby had been born the same year that the Brown v. Board of Education ruling had been issued, 1954. Thus, by 1960, she was 6 years old. She had attended kindergarten in an all-black segregated school. She was to begin first grade in the fall of 1960. The authors of the manifesto had been misinformed. Many, if not most, Negroes were not satisfied and happy with their treatment under Jim Crow laws and customs, and some were ready to actively resist the system, starting with the integration of the schools. This included Ruby Bridges' mother, Lucille Bridges. The African Americans weren't the only ones ready to resist something. As in most of the South, the white New Orleans School Board had resisted implementing the 1954 Supreme Court decision. In 1956, a federal judge in Louisiana ordered the New Orleans School Board to create an effective plan to desegregate the city's public schools. The ruling aroused opposition from parents, school board members, city leaders, and elected officials, and they worked to put in place state legislation to overturn that decision. They managed to fend off the federal court-ordered desegregation for 4 years, but they were finally forced to put some sort of integration plan in place to go into effect in 1960. Still, the plan was to start very small and move very, very slowly. 2 schools in a poverty-stricken portion of the city would be integrated on a 1 grade per year basis, starting with the 1st grade. In early 1960, Ruby Bridges lived just 5 blocks from an all-white school, but took a bus to attend kindergarten in an all-black school several miles away. As part of the school board's plan, a test was to be given to 137 African American students, allegedly to see which ones would be academically suited to attend a white school. It is said that it was written to be unusually difficult so that any of the students would have a hard time passing. The idea seemed to be that if all the African American children taking it flunked it, that might give the school board an excuse to put off integration indefinitely. Ruby Bridges passed the test, one of only 6 African American students to do so. And in the end, the families of 2 of those 6 decided against having them participate. So only 4 little girls were chosen for the integration process. Even though the children had passed the test, the school board was still stalling when schools opened in September 1960, so the girls started 1st grade in segregated black schools. But by November, the school board could no longer hold back the inevitable, and they agreed to start the integration process with the 4 little girls on Monday, November 14th. Three other 6-year-old girls who passed, Leona Tate, Gail Etienne, and Tessie Prevost, were assigned to integrate the McDonough No. 19 Elementary School, another all-white school in the same district where Ruby lived. This docucommentary focuses primarily on Ruby Bridges' experience, only because there has been much more extensive documentation available on her story for a long time. You can be assured, however, that their experiences were extremely similar to hers. If you want to know more about the other children, just do an internet search on the McDonough 3 as they became known. In the 2 weeks leading up to November 14th, the Louisiana legislature had been meeting in special sessions, still trying to find a way to stop the institution of integration in their state, which was to be started in New Orleans. One ploy had the state superintendent of schools, a staunch segregationist, declaring a statewide school holiday for November 14th to stall for time. The school board of New Orleans resisted this interference out of fear of repercussions from the federal government and planned to keep the schools open and proceed with integration plans. In Baton Rouge, legislators opened a session on November 13th with prayers for strength and wisdom before proceeding to devise even more desperate schemes to keep black people in their place. They planned to fire the 4 members of the 5-member New Orleans school board who had voted for integration and to pass a bill cutting off all state funds to integrated schools. Louisiana State Senator Speedy Long of Jena was particularly outspoken in the deliberations as he declared war on the whole Negro population, calling for economic sanctions. It would mean firing the colored maid, no matter how good she is, he ranted. Do not patronize the barber who has a colored shoeshine boy. Do not patronize the service station with a colored grease monkey. At the last moment, a federal judge stepped in and signed a restraining order to stop the state's efforts, to be enforced by the power of the federal government. Back in New Orleans, things were getting even uglier as Monday morning, November 14th, arrived. Mobs of white protesters started forming. Here is a group of protesters that was forming around Ruby's new school. Notice the cheery Christmas greeting on the sign held by the young man on the right. All I want for Christmas is a clean white school. In light of all the protests, a federal district court judge requested that federal marshals be sent to New Orleans to protect the children who were about to face the mobs. And so Ruby's walk into history began. Years later, in her autobiography, Through My Eyes, Ruby described the beginning of that day in her own words. On Sunday, November 13th, my mother told me I would start at a new school the next day. She hinted there could be something unusual about it, but she didn't explain. There might be a lot of people outside the school, she said, but you don't need to be afraid. I'll be with you. On November 14, 1960, Ruby and her mother were picked up at their home by U.S. Marshals, who drove them to nearby Walter Frantz grade school. A crowd was already gathered at the school anticipating their arrival. Ruby described what happened next this way. Driving up, I could see the crowd, but living in New Orleans, I actually thought it was Mardi Gras. There was a large crowd of people outside of the school. They were throwing things and shouting, and that sort of goes on in New Orleans at Mardi Gras. Ruby and her mother got out of the car and were escorted into the school by the marshals. But there would be no spelling or arithmetic lessons for Ruby that day. She and her mother spent the whole day in the school office. Angry Wright parents would storm into the office and rant for a bit, and then rush down the halls to find their children and yank them from the school. All of them. Ruby was totally bewildered by it all, and for a time actually didn't understand that all of this insanity was caused by her mere presence at the school. At 3 p.m., Ruby and her mom were escorted out of the school by the marshals, through the screaming mob, and back to the car to be returned home. Later that day, she went out to play jump rope with a friend. She taught her friend a catchy little chant she had heard on the street that day, and they jumped rope to it together. 2, 4, 6, 8. We don't want to integrate.
Racial hate and street violence.
Yes, innocent little Ruby had no clue what integrate meant, and had no idea that this chant had been directed at her. By the second day, the situation in New Orleans was continuing to deteriorate. One of the biggest bigoted politicians in New Orleans at the time was a man named Leander Perez. Tuesday night, November 15th, Perez gave a fiery speech at a white citizens' council meeting to a crowd of about 5,000. Don't wait for your daughter to be raped by these Congolese. Don't wait until the burrheads are forced into your schools. Do something about it now. By Wednesday morning, massive and extremely rowdy crowds of high school students began taking to the streets of New Orleans to protest the 4 little Negro girls attending a white school. This is part of a mob of at least 2,000 of the teens waving Confederate flags, making sure the public who might see their photos on the news later knew that their actions were in defense of their heritage. They also displayed a banner marked KKK and misspelled signs denouncing integration as they raised their voices in a hymn-like anthem that some bigot had come up with. Glory, glory, segregation. Yes, sung to the tune of Battle Hymn of the Republic. By later that day and into the night, the situation spiraled into acts of vandalism and random acts of terrorism and violence against any Negro bystanders, including a cross burning in a residential neighborhood with a dozen or more Negroes taken to hospitals after assaults. In other developments that week, a hearse pulled up to the home of one of the McDonough 3 girls one night, and the driver announced he had come for the body. And on another day, the family received a funeral wreath delivered COD. Meanwhile, Leander Perez announced he would donate an industrial building as a site for a new private school to be set up for the younger children who had been attending France and McDonough schools, and would provide money for school operations and for buses to get the children there. Perez's own section of New Orleans wasn't slated for integration yet, so he invited older children from the 2 schools to transfer to schools there. So these alternatives were quickly up and running. Back at William Frantz Elementary School, when Ruby returned on Tuesday, there were only 2 white children left to attend the school, although she never got to see them. One was the daughter of a young church pastor named Lloyd Foreman. He had decided he and his family could not go along with the hate-filled masses, and he brought his 5-year-old daughter Pammy back to school. Here Lloyd is with Pammy on their way to school on that day, chatting with a reporter. Lloyd and Pammy were not accompanied by marshals. They marched past the gauntlet without any protection, receiving the full wrath of the crowd, as did the one other white parent who brought her child to school, former Army WAC Daisy Gabrielle with little Yolanda, shown here almost enveloped by the pressing crowd, a crowd not made up of men in hooded KKK uniforms, but of mothers and grandmothers determined to keep their children from contamination by tiny little Ruby. Famous author John Updike wrote in the New Yorker magazine about the situation on December 10, 1960. Last week, Reverend Lloyd Foreman and Mrs. Daisy Gabrielle were shown in the newspapers in the act of escorting their daughters to a New Orleans elementary school, holding the hands of small, white-faced little girls named Pamela and Yolanda, while behind them segregationist banshees scream obscenely, and the outraged hate of millions of Southern fellow parents focuses on them. We have become familiar with the heroism of the Negro children who each autumn carry the tide of equal rights a little deeper into the South. Together, the two schools that have been blasphemed by the presence of 4 small colored girls had a normal enrollment of 1,000 pupils and close to 2,000 parents. Of those 2,000 parents, how many sincerely believe that racial division is divinely ordained? One way or the other, under the pressures that a community can apply, all who hold these attitudes have been chipped away, leaving for us to see 2, a Christian minister and an ex-army whack whose husband spent 3 years in a foxhole in New Guinea and wasn't going to let a mob of women tell him what to do. Out of 2,000, 2. Yes, just 2 other children to be in William Frantz School, but not with Ruby, not even with each other. Each was taught in a separate classroom. Years later, Yolanda recalled that she caught sight of Ruby only once through a slightly opened classroom door, and Pammy Foreman mentioned getting into trouble once for peeking through a window and seeing Ruby. And Ruby later remembered how she heard other children in the hallway and yearned to be allowed to go find them and play with them. Actually, Ruby and Pam did finally get to meet, captured on a CBS special in 2010. Here they are, swapping memories. That's Pam on the right, Ruby in the middle, and CBS reporter Michelle Miller on the left. Both the Foremans and the Gabrielle family faced a lot more problems because of their choice than just the daily walk past screaming women. Protesters holding Bibles gathered outside Pastor Foreman's parsonage to scream, on occasion throwing rocks at a black and white family dog, for, of course, he was an integrated dog. When bomb threats followed, the family had to leave their home. They couldn't get a room at a hotel as none would accept them. They ended up moving from house to house, staying with the families of other ministers. Some protesters even waited on Sunday mornings outside Foreman's church to harass the family. Yolanda's father, James, ultimately lost his job over the family's decision to allow Yolanda to be part of the Frantz elementary integration, and the family moved to Rhode Island. For a vivid description of what it was like to be a turncoat Southerner in the eyes of your neighbors, someone who accepted integration, listen to a comment I found on the internet from a man who recalled watching a TV show in 1960 about the events going on in New Orleans. The show included an interview with either the Foreman or the Gabrielle family, which was being conducted inside their New Orleans home. During the entire 24 minutes of the interview, you could hear the banging and thumping of the rocks and bricks being thrown against the walls of the home, the windows having long since gone missing. How bone-chilling it was then to realize the level of hate people could rise to, and how bone-chilling now to remember it. How courageous these people were to have risked so much to do something so important. John Steinbeck, author of The Grapes of Wrath, was actually on the scene on the second day when Yolanda and Pammy were being brought back to school to stay. He included his observations in his later book, Travels with Charlie. I had seen photographs in the papers every day and motion pictures on the television screen. What made the newsmen love the story was a group of stout, middle-aged women who, by some curious definition of the word mother, gathered every day to scream invectives at children. Further, a small group of them had become so expert that they were known as the cheerleaders, and a crowd gathered every day to enjoy and to applaud their performance. I've learned that in Steinbeck's original manuscript, he quoted exactly what those cheerleaders yelled at Pammy's daddy, the pastor. But many of the words were much too graphic to get past his publisher's editors. Too much chance of a legal suit. So his description was toned down quite a bit, keeping only the N-word and bastard and perhaps a few other milder terms. Someone who did read that original manuscript once noted, "Let's just say they included a lot of words sailors and athletes use." When describing the same scenes, a Time magazine article on December 12, 1960, referred to the cheerleaders' performance as an ecstasy of hatred. Here is Steinbeck's vivid description of the arrival of Ruby Bridges at school on the second day of her journey. I assume it may have been in part this description that influenced details of the painting by Norman Rockwell. The show opened on time. Sound of sirens, motorcycle cops. Then 2 big black cars filled with big men in blonde felt hats pulled up in front of the school. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. 4 big marshals got out of each car, and from somewhere in the automobiles, they extracted the littlest Negro girl you ever saw, dressed in shining starchy white, with new white shoes on feet so little they were almost round. Her face and little legs were very black against the white. The big marshals stood her on the curb, and a jangle of jeering shrieks went up from behind the barricades. The little girl did not look at the howling crowd, but from the side the whites of her eyes showed like those of a frightened fawn. The men turned her around like a doll, and then the strange procession moved up the broad walk toward the school, and the child was even more a mite because the men were so big. Then the girl made a curious hop, and I think I know what it was. I think in her whole life she'd not gone 10 steps without skipping, but now, in the middle of her very first skip, the weight bore her down and her little round feet took measured, reluctant steps behind the tall guards. Slowly they climbed the steps and entered the school. In all the research I've done on Ruby's story, there's one scene I can't get out of my mind. It's what bothered her most as a 6-year-old about walking the gauntlet daily. Actually, one woman, every day for a long time, hollered at her and threatened to poison her, so she was only allowed to eat what she brought from home. But that wasn't the worst. The worst was this. Yes, every day for many days, a group of protesters, mostly made up of motherly or grandmotherly types, would march up to the school bringing a tiny casket with a small black doll in it and thrust it into Ruby's view. That gave her nightmares. As an adult, Ruby recounted, "I would dream that this coffin had wings and it would fly around my bed at night, and so it was a dream that happened a lot, and that's what frightened me." Did you notice the Confederate flag unfurled above the crowd behind the casket in the first photo? All these folks were making sure the world knew they were acting in defense of their heritage. When I first examined those casket photos, suddenly the faces on the participants distinctly brought to mind other photos I'd seen. Contemplate the absolutely joyful looks on the faces of these people surrounding the casket again. Remember, this was in 1960. Now go back with me about 40 years earlier to 1919, to the era of the grandparents of those people. And look at these folks leering cheerfully into the camera. The 1960s folks were joyous about showing off the effigy of a dead black baby. So what were the folks in the era of their grandparents joyful about showing off? Here's the full photo that the close-up above was taken from. Yes, that is no effigy they are gloating over. That is the actual ashen remains of a human being, a black man named Will Brown lynched by the vigilante mob with his body still smoldering from being set aflame. In a central plaza in Omaha, Nebraska, September 28, 1919. Omaha native Henry Fonda was a young teenager at the time and witnessed all this from a nearby building. The vision disturbed him for the rest of his life. On the morning of November 28th, Will Brown was being held in the jail on the 5th floor of the beautiful new county courthouse in Omaha on charges of attacking a young white woman. A crowd of white citizens began gathering around the courthouse around 3 in the afternoon, growing to 4,000 by 5 o'clock, when they began active agitation to demand that Brown be turned over to them for lynching. The crowd continued to grow, becoming ever more violent throughout the afternoon and on into the night. They eventually stormed the courthouse, smashed most of the windows, rampaged through the building, destroying the interior, poured gasoline on lower floors and torched them, and engaged in gunfights with the police. By 11 p.m., the crowd was estimated at 20,000, and they captured and almost succeeded in hanging the mayor of Omaha, who was rescued at the last possible moment by the police. The mob eventually captured and succeeded in lynching Brown. When all was said and done, most of those involved seemed to have no regrets, as represented on the faces of those in the photo gathered around the smoldering body of the victim. As reported in the New York Times the next day, those persons who took part in the mob violence last night are, in the eyes of the law, guilty of murder. But while the mob does not meet with the approval of business and professional men of the city, it undoubtedly met with the approval of the average working men, as well as clerks, stenographers, and people of those classes. These, constituting by far the majority, are not only not ashamed, but are actually pleased at the work of the mob last night. They are proud that Omaha lynched a Negro, burned his body, wrecked a $1 million courthouse and jail, burned thousands of invaluable records, and strung the mayor of the city up to a trolley pole because he refused to order the police to throw the Negro Brown into the hands of thousands who were clamoring for his blood. That sentiment is not confined to the men. Many women, of course, are ashamed of the action of the mob, but in the main, the women are pleased. Today, scores of young girls in stores and offices were bragging about their part in the mob last night. Many told of being in the mob from its inception in the early afternoon until the closing scene when Brown's body was burned just across the street from the federal courthouse and post office. Yes, there were many grinning and leering women in the crowd that night, too. The first time I saw these Omaha, Nebraska lynching photos, and many more like them of public lynchings from all over America, I was aghast. What kind of demonic rage would it take for a huge crowd of people, both men and women, to participate in or gleefully view the torture, killing, and torching of another human being in 20th century America, in the lifetime of my own grandparents, who moved to Nebraska in 1921, just 2 years after that horrific Omaha event. Here's what terrifies me about the implications of all this. It was just 40 years from the public orgy of gleeful rage of those people in that Omaha picture from 1919 until the similar public gleeful rage of the people with that baby in a casket, emotionally threatening a small child with death in 1960. That 1919 rage didn't dissipate in pockets of American society. It just was sublimated by circumstances and laws for a time, until it burst out full bloom again in gleeful rage against what Steinbeck referred to as the littlest Negro girl you ever saw. And of course, the rage continued for years during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, as the masses in many places resisted the idea of having to drink from the same water fountains and eat in the same restaurants and go to school with people whose skin was a different color. It has now been close to 60 years since 1960. I have no feeling of confidence that the communal rage in some pockets of American society has now totally dissipated. What would it take for it to come to full bloom again? I don't know for sure, but this photo from 2016 makes me real uncomfortable. This photo was taken a few miles from where I was living in 2009. And these photos were taken in February 2018 at a white supremacist rally 3 miles from where I live now in Georgia. And after they spent their day in my hometown, they drove to a nearby rural area and continued their celebration of whiteness on into the night. Yes, this rally was sponsored by the exact same national group that celebrated into the night in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. Flyers from the KKK are being distributed all over the nation in the past several years, stuck in windshield wipers in parking lots, tucked in plastic baggies, and tossed in driveways. Unfortunately, I have no doubt that some of the descendants of the generation that lynched people in the 1800s and early 1900s and terrorized and screamed at little 6-year-old girls in 1960 are carrying on their families' traditions and hoping for a whiter tomorrow, including Rick Tyler of rural eastern Tennessee, who literally ran for Congress in 2016 on a platform to make America white again, and including this fellow, casting his vote in the 2018 election in Mississippi. But it's time to return to 1960 and go back to considering that generation's efforts at terrorizing little black girls. Here's how one internet blogger put their own response to learning about the baby casket insanity. I also think about all these white people in the crowd. Not only did they feel obligated to come for a chance to harass the little soul, but they came prepared. Some of them brought these little babies' caskets with black dolls inside, so they could make their point clear to the 6-year-old. Where does one get a baby's casket? At a funeral home? Supermarket? Did they build the caskets themselves? As a family activity? So they come home from a church service or family gathering on Sunday and tell their kids, this is what we're going to do tonight. We'll buy a black doll, then we'll go to a workshop and build a small casket. Tomorrow we'll put the doll in the casket and wave it in the face of this little 6-year-old black girl on her way to your school. We'll do it in the name of the Lord. I bet she'll get scared. It will be fun. Who are all these people? Are they still around? Some of them should be alive. I wonder if they kept the babies' caskets. Yes, I wonder many things about these hellish scenes myself. I don't doubt at least a few of the people are still alive, particularly among those teenagers in the photos we've considered. What did they do with all their hate and rage? And more importantly, even among those long dead, how many of them succeeded in planting the seeds of potential rage in their own children and grandchildren before they passed on? And what would it take to have it come roaring out again? Here are more of Steinbeck's words describing his experience being present at the torment of Ruby Bridges. A shrill, grating voice rang out. The yelling was not in chorus. Each took a turn, and at the end of each the crowd broke into howls and roars and whistles of applause. This is what they had come to see and hear. No newspaper had printed the words these women shouted. It was indicated they were indelicate, some even said obscene. On television, the soundtrack was made to blur or had crowd noises cut in to cover. But now I heard the words, bestial and filthy and degenerate. In a long and unprotected life, I have seen and heard the vomitings of demoniac humans before. Why then did these screams fill me with a shocked and sickened sorrow? Thankfully, I also have no doubt that some, hopefully many, children and grandchildren of those screamers were able to get free from that curse and renounce the rage. Here's one example. This is from the comments section at the bottom of an article about the events in a New Orleans newspaper in 2010. I was in a Catholic high school that year, and one of the priests allowed us to watch the ugly spectacle on a borrowed television, to mixed reactions from my classmates. We already had one dark-skinned black in our class, and one or two less obviously so. Suddenly, for more than a few moments, my aunt's hate-contorted face appeared on the screen, obviously yelling epithets at these children and their brave parents. Though I loved her, I was deeply ashamed, having at first burst out with, "There's my aunt," and never had respect for her again. She's now over 90, and though a beautiful woman at the time, I've always seen her as the grotesque creature she appeared that day. Afterwards, I became known as the in-lover in the family, and in my neighborhood beaten up twice, without any parental sympathy. Such vicious and feral scenes, broadcast worldwide, was much more than a black eye. That entire generation knew better, and ironically, their behavior produced the opposite effect on some of their kids. Yes, I'm thrilled for those young people who were able to reject the inheritance of hate and rage. But we are not through with Ruby's story yet. We've just made it to day 2 of the siege. All of the Walter Frantz grade school teachers had refused to teach in the school while a black student was enrolled. They all left, all except one. On the second day, Ruby and her mother met Mrs. Barbara Henry, the young white teacher from Boston who had agreed to teach Ruby. Ruby was later to mention that Mrs. Henry seemed nice, but she was still nervous about being with her, as she had never had a white teacher before. Day after day, for the entire school year, Ruby and Mrs. Henry sat next to each other in an empty classroom, and Ruby learned. She couldn't go outside because of the protests for some time, so Barbara Henry played games with her in that classroom, and they did jumping jacks to music for exercise. They became best of friends. But Ruby's mother had other children to care for and a job. Starting on the third day, Ruby had to run the gauntlet of protesters all by herself, with, of course, her bodyguards around her to get from the car to her schoolroom. Former United States Deputy Marshal Charles Burks later recalled, "Ruby showed a lot of courage. She never cried, she didn't whimper. She just marched right along like a little soldier, and we were all very, very proud of her." Ruby made it through the school year, but her family paid a very high price. Ruby's father was fired from his job, local white store owners even refused to sell groceries to them, and Ruby's grandparents in Mississippi were forced off the farm where they had been sharecroppers for 25 years. Robert Coles was a child psychiatrist who worked with Ruby from shortly after she began attending William Frantz to help her in coping with the stress of the situation. He later wrote an illustrated children's book about her, based in part on his interactions with her. There's one whole aspect of Ruby's story we haven't covered yet. Just what did get Ruby through the times of stress and fear, especially after her mother could no longer be with her as she went to school and came home every day. Robert Coles gave some insight into the answer to this question in an interview some years back.
One day her school teacher said to me, she'd been looking out of the window, and she saw Ruby yet again coming to school. This time she watched carefully, and she noticed that as Ruby was walking past this mob of heckling men and women, she stopped. And the teacher saw her lips moving. I said, "Ruby, your teacher told me today that she saw you talking to those people in the street." She said to me, "Doctor, I told her that I wasn't talking to the people." I said, "Well, who were you talking to, Ruby?" She said, "I told her I was talking to God."
Could you tell our audience why you took them out?
Because I didn't want them to go to school with the niggas.
"Why were you praying to God?" She said, "I was praying for the people in the street." I said, "Why were you doing that, Ruby?" And she said, "Well, because I wanted to pray for them." I said, "You did want to pray for them?" "Yes," she said. I said, "Ruby, why would you want to pray for those people?" And then she looked at me and her eyes widened and she said, "Well, don't you think they need praying for?" That stopped me cold. "Where did you get that idea, Ruby?" She said, "Well, my mommy and daddy have told me that, and the minister told me that in church." She said, "I pray for them every morning, and I pray for them every afternoon when I go home."
I say for the mothers to keep their kids out of school all together. We're white people. We don't want them to go to school with niggas. I have 5 and they not going to school with no niggas.
But I said, "Ruby, those people are so mean to you, and they're so nasty to you. You must have some other feelings toward them besides wanting to pray for them." She said, "I just keep praying for them, and I just hope that God will be good to them." I said, "What do you say in the prayer, Ruby?" I always say the same thing. What's that, Ruby? Well, I always say, please, dear God, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. Now, I'd heard that someplace before.
So what about Ruby's shoes? After reading about Ruby, I decided that it would be appropriate to ask my photoshopping granddaughter to give Ruby some sparkly ruby shoes in this iconic photo, like Dorothy had in Oz. And after I came up with that idea, I discovered I wasn't the first person to make the connection between Ruby's journey and Dorothy's journey in her ruby shoes. When singer-songwriter Lori McKenna's son was in second grade, he did a book report on Ruby Bridges. To help him in the project, McKenna came up with a song about Ruby. I actually wrote that for his extra credit, she said. It was his oral presentation of that book report. He got an A, by the way. That song has just been so good to me because I ended up meeting Ruby Bridges, and she came and met my kids. McKenna also got to play the song on Oprah's TV show in 2005, which made it a viral hit on iTunes and brought attention to both McKenna and Bridges. Here are the words to the first verse of Lori McKenna's song, and the later section that speaks of Dorothy and Oz. Ruby's shoes would take her a mile or so to school every day, where the white people hated her. They'd scream and hold signs and tell her to go away. But Ruby's will was stronger than the bigots with the signs could ever know. She stopped every morning on the corner and prayed that someday the pain would go away. And she'd stop and she'd pray that all the hatred would go away. She was only 6 years old, but she knew. Walk a mile in Ruby's shoes. Now, Ruby knew about Dorothy and the ruby shoes that she wore. She wondered about Oz sometimes. Well, no other child ever walked her shoes before. Ruby, if birds can always fly, why, oh why can't you and I? And here's the first verse as sung by Lori McKenna. If you'd like to hear the whole thing, just search on YouTube for Lori McKenna, Ruby's Shoes, and look for this photo.
Ruby's shoes would take her miles to school every day, where the white people hated her. They'd scream and old signs and tell her to go away. But Ruby's will was stronger than the biggest with the signs could ever know. She stopped every morning on the corner, prayed that someday the pain would go, and she'd stop and she'd pray that all the hatred would go away. She was only 6 years old, but she knew. Walk a mile in Ruby's shoes.
In later years, Ruby Bridges' mother, Lucille Bridges, had these proud words to say about her daughter. Our Ruby taught us a lot. She became someone who helped change our country. She was part of history, just like generals and presidents are part of history. They're leaders, and so was Ruby. She led us away from hate, and she led us nearer to knowing each other, the white folks and the black folks.